Alors nous allons reprendre juste par rapport à la question qui m'est posée sur les faits et sur la manière d'apprendre votre cours et est-ce que les faits sont importants dans le cours qui vous est donné. Alors oui, les faits sont importants parce que pour un juriste de common law, les faits sont fondamentaux. C'est ce qui permet de savoir si une décision peut être considérée comme un précédent obligatoire ou pas. Néanmoins, je sais que tout juriste civiliste aura tendance à laisser de côté les faits, parce que c'est pas dans sa nature que lui va se focaliser sur le principe et laisser de côté les faits. Déjà pour vous rassurer, dans le cas pratique, je ne vous mettrai pas un cas pratique d'une technicité telle que vous deviez vous positionner ou vous interroger tirer les cheveux de savoir si ces faits-là se rattachent plutôt à cette affaire ou plutôt à une autre. On est dans un cours de DU qui se veut avant tout une présentation générale et je ne vous demanderai pas de raisonner parfaitement comme un juriste anglais l'aurait fait dans les mêmes circonstances, c'est pas à votre portée, on a bien conscience. Par contre, j'invite tous ceux, et j'aurai l'occasion de le réévoquer avec eux directement, qui partent à l'étranger, notamment en Angleterre l'an prochain, à déjà quand même intégrer ce mode de fonctionnement. Parce que l'année prochaine, c'est exactement ça qu'on vous montrera, de savoir si cette affaire fait précédent ou pas, est-ce que c'est discutable, quels sont les arguments dans un sens ou dans l'autre. Il faudra vous mettre dans ce moule-là. Mais ça, en effet, c'est vraiment plutôt conseil que je destine à ceux qui, effectivement, partiront l'an prochain au Royaume-Uni ou dans un pays de common law pour réaliser leur master. Pour les autres, donc je vous demanderai bien entendu de citer les affaires de référence, de raisonner au vu de ce que je vous ai présenté. Néanmoins, je dirais, la rigueur de votre raisonnement est le plus important. Si vous ne maîtrisez pas tout à fait la manière de faire à l'anglaise, personne ne pourra vous en vouloir. C'est pas en 40 heures que vous pouvez l'apprendre, cela. Donc, essayez de reprendre, peut-être de compléter un peu vos notes avec les vidéos. Si vous avez loupé quelques éléments de fait, il est facile pour vous de reprendre sur les vidéos, d'autant plus qu'elles seront remises en ligne. Je n'ai pas validé avec Madame Condis, mais normalement elles étaient censées rester en ligne 15 jours pour vous forcer à travailler régulièrement. Mais en tout état de cause, si jamais ça a bien été suivi comme je l'avais demandé et que vous n'avez plus les anciennes vidéos, vous les aurez, on les remettra en ligne avant l'épreuve. C'est-à-dire que après les cours, dans la période où vous serez censé réviser l'épreuve, on remettra en ligne toutes les vidéos, de sorte que vous pourriez à ce moment-là combler des lacunes. Oui. Oui, j'en ai parlé avec vos camarades avant votre arrivée. Alors, je pense que c'est un problème lié à ce petit outil-là, qui n'a pas dû fonctionner correctement, ou est-ce que c'est moi qui ne l'avais pas placé comme il fallait? Là, j'avoue que je ne peux pas techniquement vous dire quel a été le problème. Donc, on travaille, on a eu beaucoup de messages de certains d'entre vous, déjà nous alertant, on s'en est rendu compte aussi, et on a demandé de retravailler la vidéo. Vous verrez qu'il y a une des 2 heures qui a été déjà un petit peu retravaillée, où ils sont arrivés à gommer les parasites, mais voilà, on travaille pour l'améliorer encore, et on espère, là, on a bien insisté que ça ne se reproduise pas. Voilà. Donc voilà, et puis donc en effet, sur le cas pratique, je vous le disais, donc pas de panique, vous raisonnez avec vos connaissances, l'idée c'est que vous soyez rigoureux, que vous soyez capable d'exposer les principes clairement, de trancher la question que vous auriez réussi à identifier comme vous l'auriez fait en France. C'est vous faire raisonner en anglais en utilisant des principes de droit anglais et en maîtrisant le vocabulaire juridique anglais. C'est l'essentiel. Okay, so let's go on the issue of the reasonable man standard. I mentioned that this standard is analyzed differently considering the circumstances, considering also the skills of the defendant, and that a lot of cases are related to medical law, and on this particular law field. The principle was settled in the Bolam case, where the court considered that where the option the doctor has taken was supported by common medical practice or a body of opinion in a supportive body of opinion, the breach of the duty of care could not be established. This position was considered to be protecting too much medical practitioner, and a second case came to moderate the Bolam test. The case discusses the Bolito case. In that case, the claimant suffered brain damage as a result of a doctor's failure during intubation. That person were undergoing medical treatment, and in the course of this treatment or surgery, I can't remember, the question was about intubation, and because of a failure of the doctor in the course of intubation, that person suffered brain damage. And there was indeed a medical opinion that was supporting that the intubation at the stage of the treatment or of the surgery. And considering the Bolam test, if the court had stuck to this principle, the breach of the duty of care would not have been established, because indeed there was a body of medical opinion that was supporting intubation in these particular circumstances. But the court considered that even if there is a medical opinion that is supporting what the doctor has taken as an option, this action, this medical action, must be in conformity with a logical analysis of the situation, of the particular situation of the patient. Even if it is possible to find a medical opinion, that is supporting the position chosen by the doctor, that action must comply with a logical analysis of the situation. The medical opinion must be justified, indeed, on a logical basis, considering the risk-benefit evaluation of the situation. So the Bolito case has been analyzed as a limitation of the Bolam test, adding one more element in the legal reasoning. First of all, the medical option must be supported by a medical opinion, a body of medical opinion, medical practitioner as supporting this practice as being a normal way to behave. And moreover, this decision is in conformity with what was expected in this particular situation on a logical point of view. Even though a medical opinion is supporting that, it must have been logical to choose this option or to make this choice, considering the risk-benefit analyzed for the patient, risk-benefit for the patient analyzed at the time of the doctor was acting or taking any option. So the Bolito test has been considered as a moderation of the Bolam one, considering this logical analysis of the situation. So the skills of the defendant are a key issue in the appreciation of the existence or not of a breach of a duty of care. And I mentioned the fact that the standard of care of a professional is a higher standard than a non-professional one. And you have an example of this argumentation in the Phillips and William Whitley case, where a jeweler, a man who is usually selling jewelry, was the liability of this jeweler was challenged because after having pierced the ears of one lady, she developed an abscess to the ears, and indeed that lady was challenging the fact that the jeweler has not taken the appropriate precaution, considering the fact that she has made the appropriate sterilization of the instruments or whatever. And in that particular case, the court analyzed the fact of piercing the ears of somebody, not regarding the standard of care of a medical practitioner. Indeed, it's true, if a medical practitioner would have done that. So the standard of care here was not assessed regarding the medical standard. Indeed, a medical practitioner would have taken better precaution in piercing ears, for sure, because he knows about medicine and the appropriate steps in sterilization or whatever. But the court considered that the person who did that action was a jeweler that has not departed from the standard of care that could be expected of a man of his position and training. And he was not expected to take all the precaution which would have been taken if a surgeon had performed the same minor operation. So the liability was, the breach of the duty of care was analyzed regarding the skills of the person and not regarding the action that that person has made. For the same action, the standard of care of the surgeon would have been much higher than the one that has been considered as ruling the case for an ordinary jeweler who is not a medical practitioner. That jeweler has not departed from the standard of care expected from a man of his position. He has taken the appropriate precaution, although they were not the best precaution. For sure, a surgeon would have done better. So the skills of the defendant are taken into account. The particular lack of skill of the defendant also can be assessed. And where the defendant is a child, the standard of care of the reasonable man also apply, but is adapted. Where the defendant to the case is a child, of course, a child is not a reasonable person. A child is not always mature, has not the possibility to adapt as a reasonable person would adapt. Nevertheless, the standard of care is still the one of the reasonable person. A reasonable person in the same circumstances, but a reasonable person of the same age. That means that if the situation, if the defendant is a 15-year-old girl, her behavior will be analyzed regarding the behavior of a prudent and reasonable 15-year-old girl. It is impossible to analyze the case regarding the reasonable person standard, the reasonable adult standard. Of course, it's obvious that a child has not the maturity to behave reasonably. Nevertheless, the court will consider the situation regarding the eyes of a reasonable child of the same age, intelligence, and experience. So the Mullin and Richard case was a case where one young girl lost the sight in one eye because she was playing with a ruler with one of her mates, and at the end of the game, one got badly injured, and the court considered that the girl was behaved as an unreasonable young girl, has breached a duty of care. Yes.
So here it's just limitation, did not engage the whole liability of the person.
No, it limited liability. Actually, the court considered in that case, it's not a defense. We will see defense in a short time. It's the case, in that cases, the court considered that there was no breach of the duty of care because the standard of care was met. The issue here is the existence or not of a breach of the duty of care, and not, properly speaking, limitation to the prejudice. We will discuss that in a few minutes. So the court can indeed consider that there is no breach of the duty of care, and as a consequence that the person is not liable at all, because she has complied with what was expected from a reasonable person in the same circumstances, with the same age, the same intelligence, the same qualification. So it's important to have in mind that case law has little value, that the circumstances are important, the skills of the defendant are important, the age, the intelligence is important as well. So am I clear on this issue of breach and the standard of the reasonable man and how it is assessed by the court? Or do you have any other questions on this issue? Okay. So the last point that the court will discuss in a tort law case is the issue of causation. Indeed, the breach of the duty of care must be at the origin of the damage. It's a classical position, that's the one you may know already from the civilian appreciation of civil liability. In common law, the same rule does apply. The breach of the duty of care must be at the origin of the damage. And if the claimant's injury would have occurred irrespective of the defendant's behavior, the negligence is not established, liability is not established. Lack of causation lead the court to consider that there is no liability and that the defendant is not liable for the injury suffered by the claimant. Causation is analyzed through a particular test that is a balance of probabilities test. So that's something to remind. Causation is established by a balance of probabilities test. Is the injury caused by the breach of the duty of care or by something else that has interacted with the action of the negligent person or with the victim? And the case law is pretty harsh on this issue. The English law seems to be pretty strict. And one of the examples of the discussion that has occurred regarding causation and the assessment of this balance of probabilities test is the Barnet and Chelsea and Kensington Hospital Management Committee case. In that case, a man went to the hospital, went to the emergency room of the hospital, and the doctor who was on duty that night refused to examine this man and sent him back home, where that man died later on due to arsenic poisoning. So arsenic is a poison that is very quick and lethal. And indeed, the medical practitioner was sued for negligence. That person refused to examine the patient and sent him back home. So definitely there was a breach of the duty of care in this particular case. But considering the balance of probabilities test, the court considered that at the time that man was sent back home, there was nothing that could have been done to save him because of arsenic. Therefore, the death of that man was not due to the negligence that was obvious in that case. The death of that man was not due to the negligence of the doctor, but to the arsenic poisoning that has occurred before. I hope I was clear. He was poisoned before going to hospital. So that case failed on the point of lack of causation. Indeed, there was a duty of care. There is no discussion possible. A doctor has a duty of care on his or her patient. There was a breach of the duty of care. The doctor refused to examine the patient. However, the damage, the death of that person was not due to the breach of the duty of care. The only cause of the death was the arsenic. And at the time he was sent back home, had the doctor examined him, there was nothing left to do, and he would have died anyway. So this case fell on lack of causation. The balance of probability test also raises the question of the loss of a chance of recovery. This notion of loss of a chance of recovery, or loss of a chance of seeing his state improving, have been discussed by the court, and the British case law is really reluctant to impose liability where the negligence has caused the claimant to lose a chance. It is the injury suffered is a loss of chance. So the court are very reluctant to declare liability of the defendant in case of loss of a chance. And the Austin and East Berkshire Area Health Authority case ruled the issue. And that's also a clear example of the balance of probability test. A boy fell down from a tree and break his hip. He was sent to the hospital, and then the medical practitioner made a wrong diagnosis. And later, that boy developed a hip deformity. And the expert confirmed, it's a medical expert, that with a correct diagnosis, this boy would have developed the hip deformity with a probability of 75% of chance. Anyway, he would have had this hip deformity because he had made a terrible fall. And since the wrong diagnosis was, let's say, would have caused the hip deformity for 25% of chance only, the court considered that it did not pass, it did not satisfy the balance of probability test, that the hip deformity was for sure due to the seriousness of the fall rather than the wrong diagnosis. So, because of the seriousness of the fall, the expert confirmed that this boy would have developed the hip deformity at 75% of chances, and the court considered that 25% of chance that the hip deformity could be due to the wrong diagnosis did not satisfy the balance of probability test. Therefore, the liability of the medical practitioner was wrong in his diagnosis, was not established in that case. So you must keep in mind these three stages: duty of care and all the elements that must be discussed in the determination of a duty of care. The breach of this duty of care and the assessment of the behavior of the defendant, considering the standard of the reasonable man. And last point, the issue of causation. Causation that is established regarding a particular test, that is the balance of probabilities, is the breach of the duty of care at the origin of the damage. And if it can be at the origin of the damage, to what extent or to what percentage of chance this breach is at the origin of the damage. And courts are really strict in the appreciation of the balance of probability test. Do you have any question on this first part on tort law? Or is that clear? Or pretty clear? So we move now to the point of defenses. What can be plead to oppose validly a civil liability claim? The defenses to tort law claims. So after having studied the key point and elements of liability with intentional torts and negligent tort, I'll focus on a third part, on the defenses, and I will consider trespasses and negligence in the same part. I won't make the distinction between intentional torts and negligence. I will cover it as a whole. So defenses to tort law claims. First of all, the lawfulness of the arrest or detention is a defense in tort of unlawful detention. So that's pretty clear that it's possible to defend an unlawful detention or unlawful arrest by the proof that the detention is lawful, or that the limitation to go out is imposed by the circumstances. Lawfulness of the arrest or of the detention is a valid defense. Remember the case law I've mentioned about this miner who was stuck into the pit, and the court considered that the detention was not unlawful because it could be construed as imposing limitation to escape, limitation to go out, considering the particular circumstances of the facts. So this is a clear defense to any unlawful detention or arrest case. Case law has also considered that self-defense is a valid defense to any assault or battery or trespasses to the person claim. So self-defense is a valid defense to any assault, battery, or unlawful interference with the body of the person. Remember the trespasses case. The court considered that any unlawful interference with the body of that person is a trespass. If that person is defending himself or herself, self-defense can be pleaded. The use of reasonable and proportionate force to escape from an assault against a person or from a trespass to property. Any trespasses are covered by this defense. Self-defense can be applied either in trespasses to the person or in trespasses to property. Remember, trespass to goods, trespass to property. Self-defense can also be used in these particular cases. Trespass to goods or trespass to lands are also covered by the self-defense defense. So, however, the notion of self-defense is very close from the civilian concept of self-defense, and the case law refers to reasonable and proportionate force or answer to escape from an assault or a trespass. The consent of the victim is also a defense. The fact that the victim has consented to the trespass, let's say to an interference with his or her body. So the consent of the victim is a legal defense. In the Chatterton and Gerson case, the issue was the interference with the body of one person by a surgeon, and a surgeon who was doing a surgery over the patient, and the fact that the patient has indeed consented to the medical act, to surgery, was a valid defense to the trespass here. The consent of the victim must not have been obtained under duress. Remember this vitiating factor, duress or threats or violence. Remember, we have studied that in the contract law part. The consent of the victim must not have been obtained under duress or by threats. The fact that the consent is given because the victim fears for herself or himself, of course, make this consent a vitiated consent. So the consent of the victim must be a valid consent and must not be vitiated by duress or by threats. And there is also a discussion, and very interesting discussion, about the consent given by a minor. Indeed, can the minor, the underage person, validly consent to have his or her body being touched or examined by a medical practitioner? And indeed, in one of the very important case on family law, but also the issue in that case was the one of tort. The question was asked about the validity of a consent given by a minor to the medical examination by a medical practitioner. If you remember that case, I mentioned that case in the legal capacity part in the contract. Do I mention it? Yes, it seems to me that I've mentioned that case. The case concerned contraceptive treatment. The case concerned contraceptive treatment and the possibility for minors to obtain contraceptive treatment or contraceptive advice directly by the medical practitioner without interference of their parents. And that was challenged by the mother of 5 girls who wanted to be sure that the doctor of the medical center would not provide to any of her 5 daughters any medical advice on contraceptive treatment. The doctor, the health center refused, and therefore that mother challenged the legality of the lawfulness of the medical advices, the medical memorandum that was given to the doctor. And of course, the main issue was about parental responsibility in that case. Do the doctor infringe parental rights in giving such advices to the children? But another important part of the discussion was about tort law, because in order to deliver medical treatment, most of the time the doctor will have to examine the patient. And is a minor legally capable to consent validly to this interference with her body integrity? Remember the discussion about the notion of touching and the hostile touching. The fact of being touched is considered as a trespass, or can be considered as a trespass. Of course, in a medical examination, the patient is most of the time touched by the doctor. Actually, it's the way we are doing it in France, and I guess the British doctors are doing the same. So, is a minor a capable person regarding that? Because if the court will decide that the minor cannot give a valid consent, additionally to the interference with the parental rights, there would be a lawsuit open in tort. the doctor has examined a minor that cannot give a valid consent. So the situation was ruled in the Gillick case with the settlement of a particular competence test. Indeed, the judge in that case settled a competence test that the doctor will have to assess in order to decide whether or not the minor in front of him or her is a competent child. That means that that person, that minor, has the legal capacity to consent to a medical examination and to consent to a medical treatment. And what is very interesting in that case is the degree of preciseness the judges used, creating, let's say, a specific tool to the benefit, let's say, of the medical practitioner. As a medical practitioner, if you ask the minor these 5 questions, then you will know if he or she passes the test. And then you will know if you are allowed to do the medical examination or not. So the judges in that case are going very far in the medical technique to create a legal tool, a competence test, so as to assess the validity of the consent of the minor. So the test is applied now for any question related to medical law. Any medical law issue will refer to the Gillick competence test, because the test has been named following the case where it has been created. The Gillick competence test has been created in a case relating to contraceptive treatment, but it is now applicable to any medical law issues. So the situation of the minor and consent of the minor to interference with his or her body will be analyzed considering the Gillick competence test. There are also cases ruling the situation of mentally impaired person. Do this person are this person capable of giving a valid consent? And there are important cases about sterilization, female sterilization of adult disabled women, and the issue of validity of the consent. Indeed, it's an interference with the body, and the question of consent has been discussed in this particular issue. Still on the point of the consent, the question of assumption of risk by the victim has been discussed. The assumption of risk is the fact that the victim may have accepted to a certain degree to be in a position of being injured. The assumption of risk is treated in common law in connection with the notion of consent. The fact that the victim may have accepted to a certain degree the possibility of being injured is analyzed as a consent issue. Indeed, the victim who has engaged himself or herself in a risky activity undertake the risk of being injured to a certain point. A victim who is, playing rugby or any other risky game, take the risk of being injured and accept that risk. So the assumption of risk by the victim can come to restrict and limit the liability of the defendant if that person indeed has enrolled himself or herself in a risky activity. She can't claim to be perfectly, to have a body perfectly protected in such dangerous dangerous game or dangerous activity. That if the victim accepted a certain degree of risk, therefore the liability of the defendant can be limited. There is another notion also that has been discussed, it is the notion of contributory negligence. Contributory negligence of the victim. Contributory negligence is the defense. Contributory negligence, I don't know if you already feel what it is covering. Contributory negligence is the situation where the claimant, the victim, has put himself or herself in the position of being victim in being negligent on his or her side as well. So where the victim, the claimant, has put himself or herself in the position of being a victim, in being negligent on his or her side as well. If the victim has been negligent, this negligence is taken into account not to determine the degree of negligence of the other. Indeed, the negligence of the victim is not appreciated at the time of the assessment of the breach of the duty of care, but at the time of compensation. If the victim has been negligent, the breach of the duty of care will be established, but the right to compensation is weakened. So the negligence, the contributory negligence, does not alter the principle of compensation, but it reduces the potential award of damages that could be granted to the victim. The right to damages, the amount of damages that will be paid to the victim will be reduced, considering the fact that the victim has contributed to his or her own damage. So the contributory negligence is also taken into account regarding the aggravation of the damage. If the negligence, the own negligence of the victim have worsened the injury he or she has suffered. So you have cases where Froome and Butcher, for example, where in the car accident, the victim has not fastened his seat belt in the car. It's indeed not the cause of the damage, but the fact that the victim has not fastened his seat belt aggravated the damage, and therefore is injured in a more important way, but he has contributed somehow to the injury he has suffered. So the contributory negligence is the fact that the victim has to a certain degree, by his or her own negligence, contributed to the injury he or she has suffered. So the victim's right to compensation is weakened, but it is not extinguished. The contributory negligence cannot restrict totally liability. It is not possible to decide that there is no breach of the duty of care because the victim was also negligent. So be clear on this distinction. The contributory negligence won't lead the tortfeasor to escape from liability, but will reduce the right of the victim to compensation. So these are defenses, valid defenses that can be opposed to a negligence or an intentional tort law claim in order to either restrict liability completely or to reduce the right to compensation. So I prefer to stop the course here for today and to leave the last issue about remedies that will be awarded to the victim in a tort law claim for next week. So look at your notes I hope you will have time to do so, and prepare some question if you have, and we will exchange on a question and answer basis next week. I will see if I find a way to give you some legal vocabulary on family law, maybe that could be of interest, especially for those who want to have this knowledge about family law. So thank you for your attention, and we'll see each other for the last time next week.